The air was frozen and heavy with the dust of collapsing walls. Somewhere beyond the wreckage, the crack of a single rifle echoed. Sharp, precise, final. A German squad froze, their breath steaming in the morning cold. They had already lost 2 men without seeing where the shots came from. On the 4th shot, one soldier pointed toward a flicker of light on a shattered window pane. But when they fired back, nothing moved. The glint appeared again, 20 meters to the left this time. Panic rippled through the line. Sniper. The Germans began shooting at ghosts, wasting precious ammunition on flashes of sunlight bouncing off fragments of glass. In the ruins, a Soviet marksman, calm, unseen, watched through the reflection of a tiny mirror fixed on a stick. He never looked directly from cover. Each glint drew German eyes to the wrong place. And when they turned, he struck again. That day, the kill count tripled. The trick looked absurd, even stupid, in theory. But on that frozen morning, it became a weapon of fear. And fear, in Stalingrad, killed faster than bullets. In the early months of 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad had turned into a vortex that swallowed divisions whole. What began as Hitler's bid to seize the Volga industrial artery had become a brutal street-to-street siege, where every room, staircase, and crater carried the weight of strategy. The German Sixth Army, once numbering more than 300,000 men, was trapped inside a frozen city, encircled by the Red Army's Operation Uranus. Supply lines were severed. Airlifts failed. Hunger gnawed louder than orders. Inside that skeletal landscape, Soviet and German snipers fought a private war within the greater one. Factories, chimneys, and sewer tunnels became nests for men who hunted each other for hours over a few square meters of ground. For both sides, morale rested on these unseen duels, who controlled the silence, who broke it with a single shot. By this stage of the Eastern Front, sniping was no longer improvisation. Soviet doctrine had matured under instructors such as Vasily Zaitsev, whose training school in the ruins of the Lazur factory taught new recruits the value of patience, camouflage, and environmental deception. Every mirror shard, every puddle of ice could become a tool. When visibility was suicide, reflection became survival. Contrary to the popular myth of the lone marksman improvising a mirror trick, Soviet manuals from late 1942 already emphasized observation by reflection. They advised scouts to use periscopes, glass shards, or even the polished backs of metal cigarette cases to survey terrain without exposing a helmet or rifle scope to enemy spotters. The Germans, too, used similar methods. Simple physics turned into fieldcraft. What differed was application. The Red Army institutionalized such improvisation, encouraging snipers to adapt ordinary items into tactical instruments. The Stalingrad winter provided the perfect laboratory. Sunlight struck at low angles, ricocheting across broken masonry and snowdrifts, producing false glints that fooled even seasoned observers. A marksman could position a mirror fragment to catch that light deliberately, drawing attention where he wasn't. Once the enemy aimed at the decoy glint, the sniper shifted slightly and fired from shadow. It required nerve, timing, and the willingness to trust a piece of glass with one's life. Reports from Soviet sniper teams in January and February 1943 describe exactly this pattern. They speak of reflected surveillance, of diversion flashes used to locate enemy optics. When a German counter-sniper fired toward a suspected reflection, Soviet spotters triangulated the muzzle flash within seconds. One mirror might trigger an entire chain reaction. Misdirection, exposure, elimination. It wasn't magic. It was geometry harnessed under fire. For the Germans trapped within the Kessel, the cauldron, such deception fed psychological collapse. Exhausted soldiers saw snipers everywhere. In factory rafters, inside chimneys, beneath the snow. Every sparkle of ice looked like a scope. Panic spread not because mirrors multiplied kills by an exact factor, but because they multiplied uncertainty. Fear forced heads down, halted movement, and left units blind. In urban warfare, that paralysis was fatal. Even at higher command levels, the German Oberkommando des Heers noted an alarming rise in sniper-inflicted casualties during the final weeks of the siege. By February, Soviet reports credited some frontline units with kill ratios 3 to 4 times higher than in December. The causes were many: better positioning, collapse of German discipline, superior camouflage, but to the men on the ground, the legend condensed into one unforgettable image: the glint that killed. What looked to outsiders like a stupid gimmick, a mirror on a stick, was in truth the crystallization of battlefield evolution. It fused necessity with ingenuity, turning light itself into a decoy weapon. And in a war defined by industry and mass production, it reminded both sides that survival could still hinge on a fragment of glass held by a steady hand. That innovation didn't arise in isolation. It emerged from a broader environment, where the Red Army learned faster than it could replace its dead. Observation schools in the Volga Military District compiled frontline reports, translating them into bulletins distributed across sniper detachments. Every trick that saved a life, or ended one, was catalogued, duplicated, and refined. By the time Stalingrad fell, the mirror tactic had entered folklore as proof that improvisation could outthink precision engineering. As the encirclement tightened and radio traffic grew sporadic, word of the mirror sniper spread through rumor more than dispatch. Some swore he operated near the Red October factory. Others placed him in the grain elevators by the river. The names changed, but the effect did not. German patrols began firing at any reflection. The city itself seemed to turn against them, every window and icicle a potential sniper's eye. When the final Soviet offensive began in late January 1943, that accumulated dread mattered as much as artillery. The psychological front had already cracked, and it was cracked, in part, by light. Long before the streets of Stalingrad turned to dust, the art of deception had been quietly shaping the modern battlefield. In every major army, camouflage schools experimented with reflection, distortion, and misdirection, fields once reserved for artists and illusionists. The mirror was simply another instrument in this invisible orchestra. In 1941, as the German army advanced through Ukraine and into the Caucasus, Soviet instructors at the Central Sniper School near Moscow began compiling case studies from the front. They learned that many novice snipers were dying not from poor marksmanship, but from momentary exposure, small glints of scope lenses or binoculars betraying their positions. In response, Soviet engineers began producing anti-reflective coatings, while field trainers emphasized alternate sighting methods. One of those methods was mirror-based observation, a crude but effective workaround when proper optical filters were unavailable. A handheld mirror, angled correctly, could give a sniper a panoramic reflection of the field without exposing his face or scope. By adjusting distance and tilt, the user could spot movement and identify targets indirectly. Primitive, but ingenious. The danger, of course, was that a mirror could betray its user if sunlight caught it at the wrong instant. Thus, its proper employment demanded discipline, timing, and deep understanding of light behavior. A mental geometry that turned ordinary marksmen into silent physicists of war. By late 1942, those ideas reached Stalingrad, where snipers fought from shattered factories and cellars. The conditions were perfect for experimentation. Buildings with broken glass offered natural reflective surfaces. Ice-coated walls shimmered even without mirrors. German soldiers, often arriving from snow-covered steppe into the shadowy ruins, found their senses deceived by flickering light. To them, the Soviets seemed to be everywhere, an army of ghosts who killed through the shimmer of shattered windows. Accounts from the 62nd Army archives record multiple Instances of deceptive reflections. 1. Observer's note describes how Comrade G, Ahidruhai Purditi, Chalant, positioned near the Krutoy Log ravine, employed reflective debris to mislead enemy spotters. 3 shots were returned at decoy glints before counterfire was initiated. Such brief field entries rarely mention names or details. Still, they reveal a pattern, reflection as both shield and lure. While Soviet doctrine encouraged creative camouflage, German forces depended on technical superiority. Their optics, Zeiss and Hensoldt, offered remarkable clarity, but were also vulnerable to counter-sniper detection. Soviet spotters quickly learned to scan for the faint, circular shimmer of those precision lenses. A mirror flash, placed deliberately nearby, could draw a counter-sniper's attention long enough to expose that shimmer. When the German fired, his muzzle flash betrayed him. Within seconds, the Red sniper's return shot ended the duel. The tactic's success relied on teamwork. One man held or positioned the mirror, often on a stick, helmet, or rubble fragment, while the other remained hidden with the rifle trained on the anticipated line of fire. The mirror bearer risked nothing more than a glint of light. The sniper risked everything, yet when done right, the result was devastating. A 2-man cell could neutralize multiple enemy shooters without ever revealing their real nest. By February 1943, the Soviet sniper network in Stalingrad had become a model for the entire front. Dozens of marksmen earned commendations not merely for accuracy, but for creative use of battlefield environment. Among them were women, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Maria Polivanova, and Natalia Kovshova, whose adaptability and observational precision helped refine deceptive techniques later adopted across multiple sectors. The mirror tactic, though small in scale, symbolized a larger transformation, the Soviet Army's shift from sheer endurance to tactical sophistication. No longer merely absorbing blows, they were learning to manipulate perception itself. It was a psychological evolution mirrored, literally, through every piece of glass that turned sunlight into a weapon. Across the lines, German officers began issuing new instructions. Avoid unnecessary exposure, cover reflective surfaces, and never pursue shots at phantom flashes. But discipline collapsed under stress. A soldier conditioned to react to light could not unlearn that instinct overnight. The result was chaos, a battlefield where every sparkle triggered panic. As the encirclement closed around the Sixth Army, reports from German divisional journals grew increasingly desperate. Sniper terror, one entry read, is constant. Reflections from debris and windows induce firing by nerves alone. Ammunition was dwindling, morale disintegrating. Mirrors, snow, and shattered glass had merged into one continuous nightmare of perceived threat. The mirror trick, whether born of one man's improvisation or many minds adapting under duress, became legend precisely because it captured the essence of Stalingrad, the triumph of cunning over might, of adaptation over machinery. In a world of tanks and bombers, victory sometimes belonged to a fragment of broken glass. The mirror's glint would soon fade from the ruins of Stalingrad, but its lesson, the power of perception and deception in modern warfare, would echo across every front that followed. Behind every rifle lay a man whose world had narrowed to the width of a sight. For snipers on both sides, the fight was not only marksmanship, it was a contest of patience, heartbeat, and nerve. In the rubble of Stalingrad, where the wind hissed through holes in concrete, minutes stretched into eternities. A trembling finger could betray position. A misplaced breath could fog the lens and cost a life. The mirror trick exploited one thing above all: human instinct. A flicker of light is an ancient trigger in the brain, a signal of danger or movement. The German soldiers who faced these glints were not fools. They were reacting exactly as evolution had trained them to. But that natural reflex became their undoing. Every time they turned toward the flash, the sniper observed their motion, measured angles, and chose his moment. To the man behind the rifle, success felt less like triumph and more like survival. He was not thinking of multiplying his kills. He was thinking of staying alive one more hour. Yet, with every mirrored deception, his confidence deepened. Fear changed sides. The enemy's uncertainty became his protection. In his after-action notes, Soviet sniper instructor Vasily Zaitsev wrote that a sniper must think like a hunter, but act like a mathematician. He referred not specifically to mirrors, but to mental calculation, distance, light, time. Still, the mirror trick embodied that same synthesis, the cold reasoning of geometry married to the raw pulse of survival. Human ingenuity turned fragility into control. The true power of the mirror trick lay in its tactical simplicity. Unlike artillery or armored maneuvers, it required no logistics, no fuel, no signal coordination. A sliver of glass could decide the tempo of an entire skirmish. Consider the geometry. A mirror angled at 45 degrees could project a glint tens of meters away, depending on sunlight and elevation. If placed behind cover, the sniper could remain invisible while the reflected light appeared to originate elsewhere, from a window, a rifle scope, or a helmet. The result? The enemy aimed and fired at empty space. Those few seconds of distraction were lethal. Soviet sniper teams used this tactic not only defensively, but offensively. When assault groups prepared to advance across open ground, hidden marksmen deployed small reflective decoys to draw fire. Once German shooters revealed themselves, Soviet gunners zeroed in with mortars or machine gun fire. The mirror became a form of communication, a silent flare that said, "There they are." German field manuals soon warned against such ruses, advising soldiers to ignore transient flashes unless confirmed by observation. But doctrine seldom survived contact with fear. In the heat of an ambush, instinct overrode orders. The mirror, therefore, operated not as a constant trap, but as an intermittent spark of chaos, a variable that commanders could never fully control. Its tactical significance extended beyond the individual kill. Each reflection forced German units to waste ammunition, to pause movement, to distrust terrain. Even when no sniper was present, the habit of scanning for glints slowed patrols and convoys. Every hesitation widened the psychological gulf between the aggressor and the defender. And in Stalingrad's frozen maze, hesitation was fatal. By the winter's end, reports from several Soviet regiments described an estimated 30% reduction in German mobility during daylight reconnaissance operations. That figure may have multiple causes: exhaustion, lack of fuel, exposure, but deception played its part. A city filled with mirrors fought like a living organism, reflecting light and death in equal measure. At first glance, a mirror appears primitive beside a telescopic sight machined by Carl Zeiss. Yet the duel between optics was precisely where the mirror proved most dangerous. It neutralized technology through the laws of physics themselves. Sniper scopes magnify light. They also betray it. Even a perfectly aligned anti-glare coating cannot completely prevent reflection when struck by direct sunlight. In the rubble of Stalingrad, where fragments of metal and glass littered every surface, those microflashes were constant. A skilled observer, using a mirror from concealment, could scan for that unique circular glint that marked a scope's lens. It was a duel of reflections, light against light. German engineers recognized this weakness and began experimenting with deeper sunshades and matte finishes. But manufacturing constraints and frozen conditions limited distribution. Meanwhile, Soviet snipers embraced improvisation. They smeared lenses with soot or grease, wrapped scopes in cloth, and even removed optics altogether to avoid shine. In this environment, the mirror was paradoxically less visible than the precision instrument designed to defeat it. The technological irony extended further. While German industry produced thousands of fine optical devices, many Soviet marksmen used captured rifles or scopes with damaged glass. When a lens cracked, they salvaged fragments, small, curved pieces that could serve as mirrors. Each jagged edge scattered light unpredictably, harder to trace, more deceptive to the enemy eye. Thus, destruction itself became an ally. Modern physics later confirmed what these soldiers learned intuitively. A flat mirror reflects at a predictable angle, but irregular surfaces produce diffuse glints that confuse directionality. What looked like luck was actually practical chaos theory in motion. Long before the term existed, by war's end, Allied instructors studying Eastern Front tactics noted this strange equilibrium. The more advanced the optics, the more they invited counter-observation. The cruder the improvisation, the safer the operator. It was a reminder that technology's advantage depends not on sophistication, but on understanding its weaknesses. In post-war sniper manuals, the mirror trick evolved into broader guidance on passive reconnaissance devices, periscopes, prisms, indirect viewing scopes. Yet few acknowledged its emotional origin. A man under siege, freezing, starving, outnumbered, had simply refused to show his face to an enemy. The mirror became his voice, his shield, his final act of control in a city reduced to ruins. The glint that began as a survival tool had turned into a doctrine of deception. It was no longer merely one sniper's improvisation, but a reflection of the entire Soviet approach. Adapt, mislead, endure. And as night descended on Stalingrad, that philosophy hardened into the city's very bones. The next phase would reveal how this small innovation resonated beyond individuals, through command, enemy intelligence, and the moral calculus of war itself. Commanders in Stalingrad faced a paradox no manual had prepared them for: an enemy that could vanish into reflections. Colonel Nikolai Batyuk, who commanded the 284th Rifle Division, understood the psychological value of snipers long before the encirclement tightened. He ordered that each rifle regiment maintain at least 10 trained marksmen, each operating semi-independently. But it was his later directive: confuse the enemy, make him shoot at ghosts. That gave structure to what soldiers had already begun instinctively. Batyuk's leadership style blended pragmatism with theater. He encouraged his snipers to stage decoy activity: dummy helmets on sticks, broken mirrors fixed on rubble, and occasional flashes timed with bursts of suppressive fire. Reports suggest that in one 48-hour period, a single Soviet sector recorded over 400 German rifle and machine gun rounds fired at decoys. A costly hemorrhage of ammunition that achieved nothing. To Batyuk, this was victory without bloodshed. On the German side, the leadership response was less coordinated. General Friedrich Paulus, trapped with the Sixth Army, issued repeated orders to eliminate Soviet sharpshooters through counterfire and reconnaissance. But as communication faltered and supplies dwindled, those orders became empty formality. Officers could not pinpoint what they could not see. Their soldiers grew afraid to expose binoculars, afraid even to peer through scope lenses lest they be caught by an unseen reflection. A breakdown of command followed. No one trusted their eyes, and without trust, control evaporated. The mirror front, as some post-war analysts dubbed it, forced both armies to rethink command at the smallest scale. Leadership had to adapt to a war fought in seconds of light, an intangible battlefield ruled by patience rather than maneuver. For German soldiers entrenched among the ruins, the mirror trick was less a tactic than a haunting. Survivor accounts from the 305th and 389th Infantry Divisions describe a creeping dread of daylight. "The Russians fire from nowhere," wrote one private in his diary. "You see a sparkle, you think it's glass, then your comrade falls." The enemy seemed to exploit even the sun itself. Every flash, Every glint off snow or steel became suspect. German counter-snipers tried to adapt. They began using indirect periscopes of their own, fashioned from metal scrap. Some placed dark filters over their scopes to dampen reflection. Others fired blindly at any suspected glint, a costly reaction that often exposed their own positions. Experienced marksmen warned against it, but fear spreads faster than logic in a besieged army. Propaganda within the German ranks soon twisted the story further. Rumors circulated of mirror devils, Soviet women who supposedly used enchanted glass to lure men to their deaths. Such superstition, recorded by Wehrmacht chaplains, reflected how exhaustion eroded rationality. When fear surpasses comprehension, myth rushes in to fill the gap. In truth, the Germans were facing something more devastating than sorcery: a perfect understanding of perception. The Red Army had weaponized psychology, turning the simplest optical illusion into a force multiplier. The more the Germans tried to counter it, the deeper they fell into paralysis. By mid-January 1943, units near the Barricadi factory reported going entire days without daylight movement, waiting for dusk to shift positions. The Soviets advanced not through superior firepower, but through the invisible power of anticipation. This transformation of fear into tactical paralysis marked one of Stalingrad's quiet victories. The mirror had become a symbol of control. One side's confidence reflected in the other's terror. War thrives on deception, yet there remains an invisible moral boundary between outsmarting an enemy and unmooring his sanity. The mirror trick raised precisely that question. To some commanders, it was an elegant expression of soldierly intellect, a harmless illusion that saved lives by hastening surrender. To others, it was psychological torment masquerading as ingenuity. German medics reported increasing cases of combat stress among frontline troops who swore they were being watched by the glass. Men flinched at sunlight, hid from reflections, and refused to enter buildings with windows intact. Fear became infection. Soviet doctrine justified deception as an extension of survival. "Camouflage is mercy," one instructor wrote, "for it spares our men while confusing theirs." The Red Army's moral calculus was shaped by necessity. Against a technologically superior foe, cunning equaled parity. A mirror might have been a trick, but so were camouflage nets, fake radio chatter, or painted tank decoys. In total war, ethics often bent to the will to endure. Yet even among the Soviet ranks, unease existed. Snipers who relied heavily on such misdirection sometimes confessed to feeling detached from the act of killing. To strike unseen, through illusion, distanced them from the humanity of their targets. One unnamed sniper reportedly wrote in his notebook, "It is strange to kill a man who never truly saw you." This moral dissonance hinted at the future, the coming era of remote warfare, where the trigger and the target would grow ever further apart. The mirror trick, primitive as it was, foreshadowed that disconnection. Deception, after all, is not just a weapon against others. It also dulls the conscience of those who wield it. The mirrored light that blinded the enemy also reflected back the soldier's own face, unseen, ghostly, suspended between hunter and phantom. The mirror, then, was not just glass. It was a metaphor for modern war itself, reflective, deceptive, fragmented, and psychological. What began as a simple survival tool had evolved into a commentary on the shifting nature of conflict. And in the crucible of Stalingrad, where every trick, every illusion, every second mattered, this interplay of mind and light prepared the stage for the moment of irreversible change. The turning point where the mirror's flash would coincide with the collapse of an army. The temperature had fallen to 25 degrees. Inside the bombed-out ruins of the Red October factory, the air reeked of oil, brick dust, and frozen blood. The German 305th Infantry Division, already down to half strength, held the last positions along the northern approach to the Volga. Their officers clung to radio contact with headquarters, their breath crackling through the static. Ammunition was low. Morale was lower. Across the rubble-strewn street, the Soviet 62nd Army prepared its final push. Among its forward observers was a sniper detachment led by Sergeant Ivan Sidorov, one of many nameless sharpshooters whose ingenuity would later be folded into legend. His orders were clear: cover the assault groups advancing toward the machine hall. But the terrain was a killing ground. Wide, open, littered with reflective ice and jagged rebar. Anyone who moved under daylight risked instant death from German counter-snipers stationed in upper floors of a shattered office block. The Soviets couldn't afford a frontal duel. They needed to break the German overwatch without losing men. Sidorov's solution was almost absurdly simple. The night before the attack, his unit had scavenged small fragments of mirror and window glass from the wreckage. At dawn, they placed them along the rim of a collapsed wall facing the enemy line. Some were fixed with wire. Others rested on snowdrifts, angled toward the rising sun. From across the street, those glints looked like movement, the telltale flash of scopes or binoculars. At 08:43, as the first rays of light pierced the mist, German sharpshooters opened fire. Dozens of muzzle flashes lit up the gray. They were firing at reflections. Within seconds, Sidorov's spotters had marked each position, tiny puffs of snow betraying the shooters' angles. Soviet mortars responded with mechanical precision. The first shells struck the third floor. Another volley collapsed the stairwell. Within minutes, 2 German sniper nests were silenced. The mirror trap had worked. But Sidorov didn't stop there. While the Germans regrouped, his men shifted several remaining mirrors, altering the angles to mimic new sniper positions. The enemy, already disoriented, assumed a second wave of Soviet marksmen had appeared. They fired again, revealing even more positions. Each shot was answered with Soviet fire from an unseen source. From the outside, it looked like chaos. Germans shouting, firing into sunlight, while invisible bullets cut them down. Yet beneath that chaos lay pure calculation. Sidorov's mirrors were arranged in a deliberate arc, each one calibrated to reflect the sun toward a different sector at staggered intervals. The flashes seemed to dance, a choreographed illusion. By Toyu, the Germans had burned through half their remaining ammunition. Communication between forward posts had broken down. Those who survived retreated into the inner rooms of the factory office block, dragging wounded comrades with them. The Red Army seized the outer yard without losing a single sniper. For the Soviets, it was more than a tactical success. It was psychological conquest. The men who had feared every ray of light now advanced behind it. Soldiers who had crouched for weeks beneath rubble stood up and walked forward, confident that fear had changed allegiance. In captured radio transcripts from the 304th Avadrimvordand Tahivei Division, one panicked message survives. We are under constant sniper fire. Flashes everywhere. We cannot locate them. It is like the city itself is shooting. That single line encapsulated the moment the balance tipped. It wasn't merely that Soviet snipers had grown more skilled. It was that the Germans had ceased to believe their senses. In warfare, perception is power. Once you destroy an enemy's ability to trust what he sees, you destroy his will to fight. The mirror trick achieved that invisibly, elegantly, without needing mass or firepower. After the battle, observers noted an eerie transformation in the German trenches. Helmets were draped with cloth. Rifles were wrapped in rags. Shards of glass were smashed under boots, an army trying to erase light itself. But in doing so, they surrendered visibility. Blindness followed. In the hours that came next, Soviet forward teams infiltrated the ruins, marking paths for assault squads. They advanced under the same sun that had betrayed so many before. Only now, the light was theirs. When the red flag finally rose over the Red October factory that evening, it signaled more than a positional victory. It marked the collapse of German initiative, the moment when the defenders of Stalingrad ceased reacting to attacks and began simply waiting for the end. And somewhere in the snow, amid twisted rebar and shattered glass, lay the mirrors that had turned sunlight into strategy. Small, fragile relics of a war fought not just with bullets, but with brilliance. The fall of the Red October Factory became more than a tactical chapter in the Stalingrad campaign. It was the psychological death knell for the Sixth Army. The mirror incident, recorded in fragments across multiple regimental logs, symbolized something far larger than its scale. It represented the precise moment when initiative, courage, and clarity of thought deserted the Germans and flowed to the Soviets. By the end of January 1943, Paulus's forces were fractured into isolated pockets, disconnected platoons surviving hour to hour, their world reduced to rubble, frost, and rumors. The sniper terror, once dismissed as exaggerated Soviet propaganda, had become daily reality. Even veteran units who had survived the Kursk and Kharkov fronts confessed to an unfamiliar paralysis. Daylight had turned hostile. Across the Volga, Soviet High Command monitored these tremors closely. Reports from frontline observers noted a striking decline in German small arms fire during daylight hours. Enemy patrols are motionless until dusk, one bulletin read. Fear of snipers exceeds hunger. What had begun as improvisation with mirror shards was now reshaping the tempo of war. When the final Soviet offensive, Operation Ring, began on January 26, 1943, it met less resistance than expected in certain sectors. The Red Army advanced block by block, meeting only sporadic bursts of fire from defenders who no longer believed they could see their enemy. The Germans fired at reflections, at ghosts, at memories of sunlight. Inside the shrinking perimeter, command cohesion crumbled. A lieutenant from the 71st Infantry Division later described the state of his company. Men fired at nothing, at reflections, at bottles, at their own shadows. We had lost the ability to tell light from danger. The comment, written after captivity, captures more than fatigue. It captures the disintegration of perception, the slow eclipse of rational warfare. At the same time, Soviet marksmen refined their methods further. In the northwestern districts, small sniper cells used the mirror trick to draw German fire away from advancing infantry. Each reflection became a signal, a whisper of light, guiding Soviet assaults through the maze of destruction. Communication by radio was unreliable. Communication by reflection was immediate, silent, and invisible to the enemy. In the frozen fog, where even sound betrayed positions, light became language. In one engagement near the Barakati plant, observers recorded an extraordinary sequence. At dawn, multiple German observers reported simultaneous sniper glints from 3 separate directions. They returned fire only to find that all 3 positions were decoys created by mirror fragments angled from a single trench. While their attention fixed on those phantom flashes, a Soviet assault group advanced from the flank. Within minutes, the German command post was overrun. By now, the cumulative toll of such psychological warfare was incalculable. A rifle bullet kills 1 man, fear kills 100. Soviet morale, conversely, soared. In their letters home, soldiers spoke of owning the light, of the sun fighting for us. One wrote, "Every reflection is ours now. It shines for us, not them." The mirror trick had evolved from a survival mechanism into a symbol of dominance. What began as the act of one sniper shielding his eyes from direct exposure became an emblem of collective cunning. The Red Army's quiet revenge for months of slaughter. It wasn't just about deception anymore. It was about reclamation. The same light that had blinded them in retreat now illuminated their advance. Meanwhile, German officers still tried to rationalize their collapse through material shortages or cold, but their own diaries betray a deeper truth. They were mentally defeated. One captain of the 295th Division wrote bitterly, "We are fighting a reflection, not an army." As Soviet artillery closed in, the few surviving German snipers attempted countermeasures. Smoked glass, shaded lenses, even black cloth screens over firing apertures. But the initiative was gone. Every adaptation was defensive, reactive, born from desperation rather than doctrine. Then, on January 30th, a Soviet platoon advanced past a gutted warehouse once used as a German sniper post. On a nearby desk, amid scattered shell casings and maps, they found something unexpected: a pile of broken mirrors. The German defenders had smashed them deliberately, not for camouflage, not for concealment, but for superstition. As one prisoner later explained, "We broke them so the light would not betray us again." By February 2nd, the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the nearly 300,000 men who entered the city months earlier, fewer than 90,000 remained alive. The mirrors that once flickered in the sunlight were buried beneath snow and ash. Yet among Soviet soldiers, stories spread quickly. Stories of the sniper who blinded the Germans with glass, of the reflections that killed faster than rifles. Some said he was a factory worker before the war. Others claimed he never existed. The reality mattered less than the truth beneath it. That ingenuity, born from desperation, could break an empire's pride. In later years, Soviet historians downplayed the legend's theatrical elements, but the soldiers who survived Stalingrad remembered. They remembered the fear in the enemy's eyes, the silence after each glint, and the day the sun stopped being neutral. That was the true turning point. Not a specific explosion or surrender, but the invisible moment when light itself changed allegiance. The guns fell silent on February 6, 1943. Snow drifted through the skeletal remains of Stalingrad as Soviet troops marched among the ruins that had once echoed with constant fire. What remained of the German Sixth Army, cold, starving, and broken, filed into captivity under the gaze of soldiers who, months earlier, had been the hunted. The city was a graveyard of metal and men, a landscape of silence and surrender. In the immediate aftermath, Soviet command began documenting the factors that had contributed to their improbable victory. While artillery and encirclement dominated official reports, the psychological dimension of the campaign appeared repeatedly in officers' notes. They wrote of an enemy paralyzed by invisible threats, of positions abandoned in daylight, and of morale collapsing under continuous sniper terror. The Mirror Incident, though small in scope, was cited in several field summaries as emblematic of that invisible war. To the Soviet military, Stalingrad became not only a battlefield but a lesson in adaptive warfare. Instructors at sniper schools in Moscow, Leningrad, and Magnitogorsk began incorporating case studies of urban deception tactics drawn from Stalingrad's survivors. Reflective observation was now taught systematically, not as myth, but as method. In training yards, recruits learned to angle glass or polished metal to view open ground while remaining behind cover. They practiced timing glints with bursts of machine gun fire to mask true sniper locations. Soviet bulletins published through 1943 recorded measurable results. In subsequent offensives, notably at Kursk and the Dnieper crossings, sniper kill ratios improved significantly. The tactics born in Stalingrad's ruins, including the mirror decoy, now multiplied across the Eastern Front. Improvisation had matured into doctrine. Meanwhile, captured German documents painted a grim mirror image. Reports from the Sixth Army's surviving officers reveal a loss of psychological coherence that no reinforcements could have reversed. Their soldiers had ceased trusting the battlefield environment. "Every shimmer, every movement of air," wrote a sergeant from the 389th Infantry Division, "we took for a Russian scope." Others described hallucinations, reflections on ice mistaken for rifles, sunlight interpreted as gunfire. In the final weeks, the line between physical and imagined threat vanished completely. The Red Army's political departments understood the propaganda value of this collapse. Soviet newspapers soon published articles celebrating the hunters of Stalingrad, presenting them as symbols of wit and courage overcoming precision and machinery. Illustrations showed a sniper crouched behind a mirror, deceiving a hapless German officer, a visual shorthand for the entire Eastern Front struggle. To a population exhausted by years of retreat, it was a story of intellect triumphing over arrogance. The mirror legend took on a life of its own. In barracks across the Soviet Union, recruits repeated tales of the nameless sniper whose stupid little trick broke the invader's spirit. Whether Ivan Sidorov ever existed exactly as described became irrelevant. The story's endurance lay not in its literal truth, but in its emotional truth, that cunning and courage could reverse fate when steel and numbers failed. Outside the Soviet sphere, Western observers heard the tale in fragments. War correspondents attached to the 62nd Army mentioned light decoys in dispatches, though few grasped their significance. British and American military analysts studying captured equipment noted the same psychological principle. The U.S. Army's 1944 Field Manual on Camouflage included an obscure footnote: reflected light, if used judiciously, may serve as deception for observation posts. A quiet acknowledgement of Stalingrad's shadow lessons. In the ruins of the Red October and Barricade factories, Soviet engineers catalogued thousands of enemy rifles and optics for post-war study. Many scopes bore cracked lenses, evidence of direct counter-sniper hits. Some were scorched, others bent from concussive shock. In the eyes of Soviet analysts, these shattered instruments symbolized a broader truth: that technology, without adaptability, collapses under pressure. The mirror, humble and fragile, had become a metaphor for resilience. It reminded commanders that even in the age of mechanized war, human ingenuity remained the decisive weapon. When the smoke finally cleared and spring thaw began to melt the ruins, Stalingrad ceased to be just a battlefield. It became a laboratory of modern war. The Red Army, hardened by its victory, no longer fought as the desperate defender of 1941. It now carried with it the distilled experience of every street, basement, and shattered wall. Lessons that would shape its campaigns for the rest of the war. Among these lessons, few were as quietly influential as the one born from that gleam of reflected light. Soviet High Command recognized that deception, when combined with patience and precision, could achieve what artillery alone could not: psychological dominance. In subsequent offensives across the Don Basin and Ukraine, entire sniper battalions employed decoy flashes to screen troop movements or trigger premature enemy fire. The simple idea of turning light into confusion had matured into an institutional practice. At the Central Sniper Training School in Veshnyaky, instructors reconstructed mirror simulation drills. They used small glass fragments mounted on sticks to teach recruits how to manipulate angles and reflections for observation. Not every sniper used the technique in combat. It was situational, dependent on light and terrain. But every student learned the principle: make the enemy see what you choose him to see. Captured German veterans later confirmed the tactic's enduring impact. During post-war interrogations conducted by Soviet and Allied intelligence, several Wehrmacht officers recalled the phantom flashes of Stalingrad with lingering dread. One lieutenant remarked that his men preferred darkness to daylight, for daylight betrayed us. Another simply said, "The Russians learned how to fight with light." That phrase resonated far beyond the ruins of the Volga. Military theorists in Moscow and Berlin alike studied the phenomenon, framing it within the broader science of perception warfare. The conclusion was simple but profound: fear magnifies deception. The mind, once conditioned to expect danger in every reflection, becomes its own enemy. Meanwhile, Western military observers, poring over battlefield analyses, recognize the strategic significance of psychological erosion. The mirror tactic entered NATO training materials only indirectly, as part of a growing emphasis on battlefield deception. Smoke, false targets, dummy vehicles, reflective countermeasures. Yet its spiritual ancestor could be traced back to those fragments of glass in Stalingrad's rubble. For the soldiers who lived through it, however, the aftermath was deeply personal. Many Soviet snipers never returned to civilian life unchanged. Their skill had saved lives, but their memories were filled with stillness and isolation. Long hours of waiting, watching, killing without being seen. To them, the mirror was both tool and tormentor, a silent companion that reflected more than sunlight. It reflected the cost of survival. In post-war memoirs, veterans often spoke of the echo of glass. Some could no longer bear the glare of bright winter mornings. Others collected mirrors obsessively, unable to explain why. They carried the reflection of Stalingrad within them, an imprint of both victory and trauma. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Red Army had advanced all the way to Berlin. On its path, it had turned every lesson of Stalingrad into doctrine: camouflage, deception, adaptation. But the small story of the mirror remained a footnote, preserved in oral accounts, whispered among snipers as proof that intellect could wound more deeply than firepower. The final official recognition came in 1947, when Soviet military archives declassified a section of Tactical Field Innovations of the 62nd Army. Among reports on weapon calibration and terrain adaptation, one short paragraph stood out. Use of optical reflection as diversion proved effective in neutralizing enemy observation posts. Recommended for limited tactical employment under favorable light conditions. A dry, bureaucratic summary. Yet behind it lay a human triumph. A few pieces of broken glass that had turned the tide of perception in one of the bloodiest battles of history. When historians later tried to calculate how many lives the mirror trick truly affected, the numbers were impossible to fix. But one truth remained indisputable. In a war defined by industrial might and mechanized death, victory at Stalingrad had also been forged by the oldest weapon of all, the mind. And in that shattered city of smoke and frost, even the light itself had learned to choose sides. In the long memory of the Second World War, most weapons are measured by weight, caliber, or range. But some, like the mirror of Stalingrad, defy measurement entirely. They existed not in steel or powder, but in the fragile space between fear and imagination. The mirror trick did not alter the war's grand strategy, nor did it change the mathematics of destruction. Yet it revealed something deeper about humanity in conflict: the capacity to turn even the smallest object into an instrument of survival and control. It showed that intelligence could be as lethal as machinery, and that light, when understood, could wound more effectively than darkness. Stalingrad became the graveyard of German ambition, but also the birthplace of a new kind of warfare. One that recognized the mind as terrain. Every reflection, every flicker, every silence could be weaponized when courage met creativity. In that realization lay the evolution of modern combat, from brute force to psychological precision. The shattered mirrors of 1943 were eventually buried beneath reconstruction. Factories were rebuilt, glass returned to windows, and the city once again reflected sunlight without fear. Yet, somewhere beneath those foundations lies the echo of that strange duel. One fought not for glory, but for understanding. Because in war, victory is rarely about who fires first or who fires last. It belongs to those who see differently, who find clarity where others see confusion, who turn fragility into advantage. The sniper who angled his mirror toward the dawn may never have known how far his reflection would travel. But through that sliver of glass, he illuminated a truth as enduring as the city he defended. That even amid the ruins of civilization, the human mind remains the most adaptable weapon ever forged.